In the beginning, it was just another ordinary morning at Jefferson High School. The students walked into Ms. Carter's science classroom with the usual mix of energy. Some tired from staying up late, some chatting happily with their friends, and a few already seated quietly at their desks. The bell rang, and Ms. Carter greeted them warmly, as she always did. She was known for being both kind and attentive, someone who could turn even the most complex science topics into lessons that felt interesting and easy to follow. Everyone expected this class period to be just like all the others. However, something unexpected was about to happen, something that would turn a normal lesson into a very unusual experience. Ms. Carter began writing on the board, explaining the day's topic. At first, everything seemed perfectly fine. The students were listening, taking notes, or raising their hands to answer simple questions. But as Ms. Carter glanced around the room, her eyes paused on one particular student. She couldn't explain why, but something felt different. This student wasn't behaving in the usual way. It wasn't about poor behavior or distraction. It was something more subtle, something harder to define. The student's expression seemed distant, almost as if they were lost in another world, not truly present in the classroom. Ms. Carter's instincts told her that something was off. At first, she tried to ignore the feeling. Teachers often notice little things, students daydreaming, doodling, or simply being tired. But the longer she observed, the stronger the feeling grew. The students' eyes didn't move like they normally did when following the lesson. Their body language was stiff, and even their breathing seemed slightly unusual. Ms. Carter, who had spent years watching children grow and change, knew that this was not the typical behavior of a distracted teenager. It was something deeper, something that required her full attention. She continued teaching for the sake of the rest of the class, but inside her mind was racing with questions. Was the student feeling unwell? Were they going through a personal struggle? Or was there something else entirely happening that she could not yet understand? The air in the classroom suddenly felt heavier, as if the ordinary flow of the lesson had been interrupted by an invisible weight. Ms. Carter's concern grew. She asked the student a simple question related to the lesson, hoping to bring them back into focus. The student looked up slowly and answered in a voice that sounded almost detached, as if they were speaking from far away. The words were correct, but the tone and the manner of speaking sent chills down Ms. Carter's spine. It was at that moment she realized she was not just imagining things. Something truly unusual was happening. What had started as a normal science lesson was no longer ordinary. The atmosphere had changed, and Ms. Carter could feel it deeply. The rest of the students carried on without noticing, but she knew that her attention needed to remain on that one student. The day had shifted from routine teaching to a moment filled with mystery, concern, and the sense that something hidden was waiting to be discovered. Ethan sat at his desk with his hands fidgeting nervously. From the outside, it looked as if he was simply restless, like any other student waiting for the clock to move faster. But if someone looked closer, they would notice that this was not the usual kind of restlessness. Ethan's eyes moved quickly around the room, not focusing on anything for long. His breathing was uneven, and he shifted in his seat as though he could not find a comfortable position. It was clear something inside him was not at peace. He seemed to be fighting against a problem that no one else could see, a problem hidden deep within his own mind. The strange thing was that Ethan could not even bring himself to name what he was going through. It wasn't like he could raise his hand and say, "I'm nervous," or "I'm scared." The truth was more complicated. He didn't have the right words for it, and even if he did, fear kept him silent. He was terrified of what others might think if he admitted that something was wrong. So instead, he kept his secret locked away, pretending as best as he could that everything was normal, even though his body and his face betrayed him. This hidden battle made ordinary moments feel heavy. While his classmates worked on assignments or whispered to one another, Ethan felt trapped inside his own head. His thoughts spun around like a storm, pulling him in different directions. One part of him wanted to get up and leave the room, to escape the pressure. Another part begged him to stay still, to avoid drawing attention. The conflict wore him down, and every passing minute added to the weight he carried. Sometimes he wondered if anyone else noticed. Did his teacher see the uneasiness in his expression? Did his friends sense that he wasn't himself? He hoped not, because the idea of explaining his feelings frightened him more than the feelings themselves. To admit that he was struggling would mean exposing his vulnerability, and Ethan had convinced himself that this would only make things worse. The thought of judgment, misunderstanding, or even pity kept him silent. On the outside, Ethan was just another boy shifting in his seat, but inside he was battling something invisible. It was like a shadow that followed him everywhere, whispering doubts and fears that he couldn't push away. The harder he tried to ignore it, the stronger it seemed to become. At times he imagined that if he spoke about it, maybe it would lose its power. But then the fear of rejection silenced him all over again. So Ethan remained quiet, restless, and confused. His silence built a wall around him, keeping others from seeing the truth. Though he longed for relief, he could not yet take the step to ask for help. And so the battle continued hidden from the world, a struggle without a name that weighed heavily on his young shoulders. In every classroom, there are dozens of small details happening all at once. Students whisper to their friends, pencils scratch across paper, and the sound of chairs shifting fills the room. Most people, if they walked in, would see nothing more than a typical scene in a school. To the outside world, everything would look ordinary. But Ms. Carter, a teacher with years of experience and a caring heart, had learned to notice things that most people would miss. While the students around her carried on with their usual chatter and routine, she kept a careful eye on them, always looking for signs that someone might need help. One day, as her science class began, Ms. Carter was teaching as usual. She wrote on the board, explained the topic clearly, and asked questions to keep the students engaged. The classroom atmosphere seemed normal. Students were laughing quietly, answering questions, and pretending to be busy when she looked their way. To any other observer, it was a perfectly regular lesson. But Ms. Carter's sharp eyes caught something different. Among the many faces in front of her, one student stood out. While the others blended into the noise of the classroom, this student's silence was louder than all the chatter combined. The child was sitting still, trying not to draw attention. But Ms. Carter noticed the subtle signs of distress. The student's shoulders were tense, their eyes avoided contact, and their expression carried a weight that didn't belong in a young face. No one else saw it, not the classmates laughing 2 desks away, not the group passing notes at the back of the room. To everyone else, this student was just another part of the background. But to Ms. Carter, those tiny hidden signs spoke volumes. She knew that behind the quiet exterior, something was not right. Her instincts told her that the student was struggling. Maybe it was a personal problem at home, or maybe it was something emotional they could not explain. Whatever the cause, Ms. Carter could sense the inner battle even when no words were spoken. Years of teaching had sharpened her ability to read students beyond their homework and test scores. She knew that sometimes the most important lessons were not about science or math, but about empathy and care. Instead of ignoring what she saw, Ms. Carter decided to act carefully. She didn't want to embarrass the student in front of the class. So she continued teaching, but her mind remained alert, making a mental note to check in later. Her concern grew quietly, hidden beneath her calm teaching voice, but it never left her thoughts. That day, Ms. Carter proved what made her special as a teacher. While everyone else remained unaware, she paid attention to the details that mattered most. She noticed what no one else did, the quiet distress of a child who needed understanding. Her sharp eye and compassionate heart reminded us that true teaching is not just about lessons from books, but also about seeing the unseen and caring when it counts the most. When the final bell rang and the classroom filled with the noise of students packing their bags, most of the children rushed out the door, eager to enjoy their break. Laughter, footsteps, and chatter quickly faded down the hallway. But Ms. Carter stayed at her desk, keeping an eye on Ethan. She had noticed his restlessness during the lesson, the way his eyes had wandered, and how his silence carried a weight heavier than it should. She knew something wasn't right. While the rest of the class left without paying attention, she made a quiet decision. Instead of letting Ethan slip away unnoticed, she softly asked him to stay behind. Her voice was calm and gentle, not strict or demanding. "Ethan, could you wait for a moment? I'd like to talk with you." There was kindness in her tone, and Ethan, though nervous, agreed. The room emptied until it was just the two of them, the noise of the hallway muffled by the closed door. The atmosphere changed. What had been a busy classroom a few minutes earlier was now a quiet, safe space. Ms. Carter didn't rush into questions. She knew that creating a sense of safety was more important than anything she might say. She began with small talk, asking about his day, his interests, and things unrelated to schoolwork. Slowly, Ethan started to relax, though the tension in his posture showed that he was still carrying something heavy inside. Ms. Carter's patience was steady. She didn't pressure him, but instead showed that she was ready to listen whenever he was ready to speak. As the moments passed, Ethan felt the difference. Unlike the noisy crowd of classmates, here he had a teacher's full attention. Unlike the usual busy routine of school, here he had quiet. For the first time that day, he wasn't just another student in a row of desks. He was seen, heard, and cared for. That realization began to break through his fear. Ethan hesitated at first. The problem inside him felt too large, too complicated, and too frightening to put into words. But Ms. Carter's calm presence gave him courage. She leaned slightly forward, her expression warm and understanding, and said, "It's okay. You don't have to rush. But if something is troubling you, I'm here to listen." Those simple words carried a powerful message. He was not alone. Finally, Ethan opened up. His voice was soft, almost shaky, but he began to share what had been bothering him. The feelings he had been hiding for so long started to spill out. It wasn't easy, but the more he spoke, the lighter his burden seemed to become. Ms. Carter listened carefully, never interrupting, never judging. In that small moment after class, something important happened. Ethan discovered that it was safe to speak, and Ms. Carter showed what it truly means to care. By calling him aside and creating a safe space, she gave him more than just time. She gave him hope, understanding, and the beginning of healing. Ethan sat in the quiet classroom, his hand shaking slightly as he tried to find the courage to speak. His heart pounded in his chest, and every second of silence felt heavier than the last. Ms. Carter waited patiently, her expression soft and reassuring. She had created a safe space for him. But even in that safety, Ethan struggled. Finally, his lips parted, and with a trembling voice, he began to reveal the secret he had been carrying alone. His words came out slowly at first, as though he was afraid that saying them aloud would make them too real. "Something is happening to me," he whispered. His eyes looked down at the floor, unable to meet his teacher's gaze. "My body, it's changing, and I don't understand why." The confession hung in the air, fragile yet powerful. As if releasing it lifted a weight from his shoulders, but also exposed him in a way he had never felt before. For weeks, Ethan had been feeling different. His body no longer seemed the same as it once had. He noticed shifts, small at first, but increasingly impossible to ignore. Sometimes it frightened him, sometimes it confused him, and most of the time it left him feeling lost. He didn't know if these changes were normal or if something was terribly wrong. What scared him most was that he didn't know who to talk to about it. His classmates would never understand, and the thought of telling his parents filled him with shame and fear. So he stayed silent, carrying the confusion on his own. But silence has a weight, and eventually it becomes too heavy to bear. That was why Ethan trembled as he finally spoke. He had been holding back tears for days, pretending everything was fine, when inside he was full of questions. Why was this happening to him? Was it supposed to be this way? Was there something wrong with him? These questions circled endlessly in his mind, leaving him restless and afraid. Ms. Carter listened with deep attention, not interrupting as Ethan spoke. She could see how much effort it took for him to reveal this hidden struggle. His hands twisted together in nervousness, his voice cracked with uncertainty, and yet he kept speaking. Every word was a step toward trust, and every sentence revealed just how much he had needed someone to hear him. When he finally stopped, Ethan looked up at Ms. Carter with wide, uncertain eyes, as if bracing himself for judgment or disappointment. But what he saw instead was compassion. Ms. Carter's calm expression told him that he was safe, that his secret wasn't something to be ashamed of, and that he wasn't alone in his confusion. In that moment, something shifted. Ethan realized that by speaking his truth, he had taken the first step toward understanding and relief. His secret was no longer locked inside. It had been heard, and in being heard, it became lighter. What began as trembling fear slowly transformed into the possibility of hope. Ethan's words still echoed in the quiet classroom. His voice had trembled as he confessed that his body was changing, and he didn't understand why. For a moment, silence filled the space between him and Ms. Carter. She could see the worry in his eyes, the fear of the unknown, and the weight of carrying a secret he could not put into proper words. Instead of rushing to respond, she took a deep breath, leaned forward slightly, and gave him a gentle smile. Then she introduced a word that would begin to change everything for Ethan. "What you are describing," she said softly, "is called puberty." Ethan blinked, the unfamiliar word hanging in his mind. Puberty? He had heard it before, maybe in passing, but he had never really understood what it meant. He leaned in closer, curious now, because Ms. Carter's calm tone made the word seem less frightening and more like a key to a mystery he had been struggling to solve. For the first time in weeks, his fear began to loosen its grip. Ms. Carter explained carefully, choosing her words in a way that was easy for Ethan to understand. She told him that puberty was a natural stage of life, something that every boy and girl experiences as they grow from childhood into adulthood. She explained that the changes he noticed in his body were signs that he was becoming older, stronger, and more mature. His voice might deepen, he might grow taller, and he might notice other physical and emotional changes. None of these things meant something was wrong. In fact, it meant everything was happening just as it should. As she spoke, Ethan's eyes widened with interest. What had once felt like a strange and frightening transformation now sounded like a journey everyone takes. Instead of being singled out or different, he realized he was part of a bigger story of growing up. The word puberty gave shape to his confusion. It turned nameless fears into something he could understand. The more Ms. Carter explained, the more Ethan's expression shifted. The worry lines on his forehead softened and his body relaxed. He even found himself asking questions he had been too scared to voice before. "So, it's normal if I feel different? It's normal if my body changes in ways I don't expect?" he asked. Ms. Carter nodded with reassurance, reminding him that curiosity was the best way to face new experiences. What had started as a painful secret slowly became a learning moment. Ms. Carter's introduction of the term puberty transformed Ethan's confusion into curiosity. Instead of dreading the changes, he now wanted to understand them. Instead of feeling alone, he realized he was on a path that everyone must take. By the end of their conversation, Ethan no longer felt the same heavy fear. With knowledge came relief, and with relief came a spark of interest. Ms. Carter had not only answered his questions, but she had also given him the gift of perspective. His journey was just beginning, and now he was ready to face it with curiosity instead of fear. After listening to Ethan's trembling confession and introducing him to the word puberty, Ms. Carter could still see the worry in his eyes. He had learned that what he was experiencing was normal, but years of silent fear and confusion could not disappear with just a single word. Ethan's hands were still clenched together, his shoulders tight, and his voice uncertain. That was when Miss Carter leaned in gently, her tone full of warmth and patience, and began to carefully dismantle his fears one by one. "Ethan," she said softly, "everything you are going through is a natural part of growing up. Your body is supposed to change. It doesn't mean something is wrong. It means you are becoming the person you are meant to be." The words were simple, but the kindness in her voice made them powerful. Ethan looked at her, his eyes full of doubt, as if he wanted to believe but wasn't sure he could. Miss Carter didn't stop there. She explained that every student in her classroom, even the ones who looked calm and confident, would face the same changes in their own way. "You are not alone in this," she reassured him. "Everyone goes through it, some earlier, some later, but no one escapes it. It's a journey every human being takes." These words lifted a weight off Ethan's chest. For so long, he had believed that his changes made him different, strange, or broken. Now he was beginning to see that he was simply human, just like everyone else. Ethan hesitated and whispered, "But what if people notice? What if they laugh?" His voice cracked with the fear of being judged, the fear that had kept him silent for so long. Miss Carter smiled gently and shook her head. "There is nothing to be ashamed of," she said firmly but kindly. "Growing up is not embarrassing. It's a sign that you are healthy and strong. The people who laugh don't understand, and one day they will go through the same thing themselves." Her words carried both truth and comfort. Little by little, Ethan's fears began to crumble. Where he had once seen shame, he now saw possibility. Where he had once felt isolated, he now felt connected to others. The changes in his body were no longer something to hide, but something to accept as part of life's natural path. By dismantling his fears with honesty, patience, and compassion, Miss Carter gave Ethan more than just information. She gave him peace of mind. He no longer had to fight an invisible battle inside his head. He no longer had to see himself as strange or broken. Instead, he could see himself as a young person stepping into a new chapter of life. In that quiet classroom, Ethan's fear gave way to understanding, and his shame transformed into a sense of acceptance. Ms. Carter had shown him that change is not something to fear, but something to embrace. And with that knowledge, Ethan was ready to face the future with more courage than before. After easing Ethan's fears and showing him that his changes were natural, Ms. Carter knew there was more he needed to hear. It wasn't just about understanding puberty. It was also about knowing how to handle it in a safe and healthy way. She leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm, and began to speak about 3 important ideas that children rarely hear explained so directly: privacy, respect, and trusted adults. "Ethan," she said softly, "the changes you're experiencing are very personal. They belong to you, and you have a right to privacy." She explained that privacy meant he didn't need to share every detail about his body or feelings with classmates or anyone who might make him uncomfortable. His body was his own, and it was normal to want space and respect as it grew and changed. These words immediately gave Ethan a sense of comfort. For the first time, he realized he had permission to protect his own boundaries without feeling guilty. Next, Ms. Carter spoke about respect. "Just as you want others to respect your experiences, you must also respect theirs," she said. She reminded him that every student in the class would go through similar changes, even if they happened at different times or in different ways. Some kids might grow taller quickly, while others would change more slowly. Some might act confident, while others would be shy. Everyone deserves kindness during this time, she explained. If we treat one another with respect, no one has to feel embarrassed or alone. Ethan nodded, realizing that respect worked both ways. It was something he wanted for himself and something he could give to others. Finally, Ms. Carter talked about trusted adults. She told Ethan that while questions about puberty were natural, they could also feel overwhelming. That was why it was important to have safe people to turn to: parents, guardians, teachers, or school counselors. These trusted adults could give clear, honest answers and provide the support kids often needed. If you ever feel confused or worried again, she said, don't keep it locked inside. Reach out to someone you trust. That's how you'll find the right guidance. Ethan thought about her words and felt relief. He had been carrying his questions alone for so long, but now he understood that seeking help was not weakness. It was strength. As Ms. Carter finished, Ethan felt lighter. The fear that had once clouded his thoughts was replaced by clarity. Puberty was no longer a dark, mysterious process. With knowledge of privacy, respect, and the importance of trusted adults, he felt prepared to face the future with confidence. What made Ms. Carter's words so powerful was their honesty. Children rarely hear these lessons spoken directly and clearly, yet in that small classroom, she gave Ethan wisdom that would guide him far beyond the walls of the school. She gave him tools not only to understand himself, but also to treat others with care. It was more than a science lesson. It was a life lesson, one Ethan would never forget. When Ethan first walked into class that morning, he carried with him a heavy burden of worry. His body was changing in ways he didn't understand, and the fear of being different had left him restless and confused. For weeks he had kept his secret locked inside, too embarrassed to speak about it and too scared of being judged. That silence made his anxiety grow larger each day, until it seemed like he was fighting a battle he could never win. But after his quiet conversation with Ms. Carter, everything began to shift. She had listened to him without judgment, explained that puberty was a natural stage of growing up, and reassured him that nothing about his experience was shameful. She spoke about privacy, respect, and the importance of trusted adults, giving him tools to protect himself and guidance on who he could turn to when he needed answers. Her words gently untangled the knot of confusion in his mind. What once felt like a terrifying mystery was now something clear and understandable. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt clarity. He finally had a name for what he was experiencing, and he finally understood that he wasn't broken or strange. He was simply growing up, just like every other person before him. That realization was powerful. It was as if a storm that had been raging inside him suddenly quieted down. The anxious questions that had circled endlessly in his mind began to fade, replaced by calm, steady understanding. As his anxiety melted away, relief washed over him like a gentle wave. He could breathe more easily. His shoulders, once tense and heavy, began to relax. He even felt the corners of his mouth curve into a small, unplanned smile. The fear that had kept him silent now seemed unnecessary. He no longer felt trapped inside his own thoughts. Instead, he felt free, as if a door had opened and allowed him to step into the light. Even more important than relief was the new sense of belonging that grew inside him. Before, Ethan had felt isolated, as though he was the only one facing these strange changes. But Ms. Carter had reminded him that everyone goes through puberty in their own way. He wasn't alone. He was part of a larger journey that connected him to every other student in the room, even if they didn't talk about it openly. That knowledge made him feel connected, not excluded. He was no longer on the outside looking in. He was right where he was meant to be. By the time Ethan left the classroom, his heart felt lighter than it had in months. The worry that once consumed him was replaced with understanding, relief, and a quiet pride in knowing he was growing, just like everyone else. Thanks to Ms. Carter's guidance, he carried with him not just answers, but also a renewed confidence. In that moment, Ethan truly felt that he belonged. After her private talk with Ethan, Ms. Carter felt proud of the courage he had shown, but she also knew something important. If Ethan had been struggling with questions about growing up, then other students in the class were probably carrying the same worries in silence. Some might not even realize what was happening to their bodies or emotions, while others might be too shy or too embarrassed to ask for help. Ethan's problem was not unique. It was simply the first one she had noticed. That realization gave Miss Carter a thoughtful idea. She needed to find a way to help the entire class understand these changes, but without making Ethan feel singled out or exposed. She decided to take action in a quiet, careful way. After school, Ms. Carter reached out to the school counselor. She explained what she had observed in her classroom and suggested that the students could benefit from a general lesson on topics like puberty, privacy, and respect. The counselor agreed immediately. Together, they planned a session that would be both educational and reassuring, something that would give every student the chance to learn without any one child feeling targeted. When the day of the lesson arrived, Ms. Carter introduced the counselor to the class as though it was simply part of the regular curriculum. She didn't mention Ethan or hint at the private conversation they had shared. Instead, she presented the lesson as an opportunity for everyone to gain knowledge about growing up. The students welcomed the change of pace, curious about what the counselor would say. The counselor began by explaining the basics of puberty in clear, age-appropriate language. They talked about how every child grows at a different pace and that no two experiences are exactly alike. They explained the physical and emotional changes that come with this stage of life and reminded the students that these changes are completely natural. As the counselor spoke, many students nodded, while others leaned forward with interest, finally hearing answers to questions they had been too afraid to ask. Throughout the lesson, the counselor also emphasized important values: privacy, respect, and kindness. The students learned that it was okay to have personal questions, but it was also important to treat others gently during this sensitive stage. They were reminded that if they ever felt confused or anxious, they could always turn to a trusted adult for guidance. Ethan sat quietly, listening along with everyone else. He felt a sense of relief wash over him. He wasn't the only one learning, his classmates were, too. Most importantly, he realized that no one suspected the lesson had anything to do with him. Ms. Carter's careful planning had protected his dignity while giving him exactly the support he needed. By the end of the session, the whole class walked away with new knowledge and understanding. And though no one else knew it, Ethan felt especially grateful. Ms. Carter had not only helped him, but had turned his private struggle into a gift for the entire class. The classroom buzzed with the usual energy as the students filed in, chatting with friends, laughing over inside jokes, and shuffling their books and notebooks onto their desks. To them, it seemed like just another ordinary school day, another lesson waiting to begin. None of them realized that something different was planned. They were about to receive information and understanding that many of them secretly needed but had been too afraid to ask for. As the students settled into their seats, the air carried a mix of curiosity and routine. A few students whispered quietly, others doodled on the corners of their notebooks, and some simply stared at the clock, waiting for the period to pass. Beneath the surface, however, many of them carried silent questions. They had noticed changes in their own bodies or emotions, but those changes were confusing, even frightening at times. They wondered if what they were experiencing was normal, but embarrassment kept their lips sealed. It was easier to pretend nothing was happening than to risk laughter or judgment from their peers. That morning, however, Ms. Carter had arranged something special. The school counselor was coming to give a lesson, and though the students didn't know it yet, this lesson would speak directly to the hidden questions that weighed on their young minds. It would give them the words and explanations they had been missing and help them see that they were not alone in their experiences. When the counselor entered the room, the students grew quiet. At first, they were unsure what to expect. Some thought it might be a lecture about rules or discipline, while others assumed it was just another boring presentation. But as the counselor began to speak, the tone was gentle, calm, and surprisingly relatable. Instead of scolding or lecturing, the counselor spoke about life changes, about how bodies grow, how emotions shift, and how all of it was part of a natural process called puberty. The moment the word was spoken, several students looked up with sudden attention. Some of them had heard the term before, but didn't fully understand it. Others had wondered about it, but never dared to ask an adult directly. Quietly, in their own ways, they leaned in, hungry for the answers they had been carrying in silence. The counselor explained that everyone experiences these changes differently and at their own pace. They reminded the students that nothing about puberty was shameful. It was simply a sign of growing up. They also spoke about respect and privacy, teaching the students to value their own boundaries and those of their classmates. For the students, it felt as though a door had opened. The questions they had hidden away no longer seemed strange or embarrassing. They were questions everyone shared, even if no one admitted it out loud. And though the students had walked into the classroom expecting an ordinary day, they discovered instead a lesson that spoke directly to their private thoughts, giving them comfort, knowledge, and a sense of belonging. The students sat in their chairs, listening closely as the counselor began to speak. At first, they expected the lesson to sound like every other school lecture, facts, definitions, and diagrams that came straight from a textbook. But this lesson was different. Instead of only talking about the scientific side of growing up, the counselor explained the personal side, the part that no textbook ever truly captures. The students quickly realized that what they were about to learn was not just about biology, but about life itself, how to grow up safely, respectfully, and with confidence. The counselor began by reminding the class that puberty was a normal stage that everyone experiences. They explained how bodies change in many ways. Voices deepen, new hair grows, emotions shift, and growth spurts happen at different times for different people. But then the counselor went further, talking about how these changes could feel confusing, embarrassing, or even overwhelming. Textbooks can tell you what happens, the counselor said, but they don't always tell you how it feels. And that's important too. The students nodded, some shyly, some with relief, because the counselor's words spoke directly to the hidden feelings many of them had carried in silence. Next, the counselor talked about safety. They explained that privacy was every student's right, that no one had the authority to make them feel ashamed of their body or to invade their personal boundaries. They reminded the class that it was okay to say no if someone made them uncomfortable, and that speaking to a trusted adult was always the right choice when in doubt. These simple but powerful statements reassured the students. Many of them had never heard an adult speak so clearly about their right to protect themselves. The counselor then spoke about respect. As you change, remember that everyone else around you is changing too, they said. Some classmates may grow taller earlier, while others may seem the same for years. Some may be shy, while others may joke about it. No matter what, everyone deserves kindness and respect. The students shifted in their seats, some glancing at each other, as if realizing for the first time that they were all in this journey together. Finally, the counselor gave them advice about trusted adults. They explained that growing up brings many questions, and it was normal not to have all the answers. But instead of hiding worries or relying on rumors, students should reach out to people they trusted, parents, teachers, or school staff who could guide them with honesty. This reminder gave the students a sense of direction. They now understood that seeking help was not weakness, but strength. By the end of the lesson, the room felt lighter. What began as uncertainty turned into understanding. The counselor had revealed truths that no textbook explained. The emotions, the respect, the safety, and the importance of care. The students left not just smarter, but more prepared to face the journey of growing up with dignity and confidence. As the counselor's lesson continued, Ethan sat quietly in his seat, listening more carefully than ever before. For weeks he had been carrying questions inside his mind, questions about the changes happening to his body, questions about feelings he could not fully explain, and questions he had been too nervous to share with anyone. Each day he kept those worries hidden, fearing that if he spoke up, people might laugh at him or think he was strange. But now, sitting in that classroom, something felt different. The counselor's words reached Ethan in a way that made him feel understood. The explanations were clear, gentle, and honest, and for the first time, Ethan realized that the confusion he carried was not his alone. Every student in the room, in one way or another, was dealing with the same journey. Some had already started noticing changes, while others would experience them later. Suddenly, Ethan understood that what he was going through was part of a bigger picture that connected him with his classmates. That thought gave him courage. Instead of feeling isolated, he began to feel a sense of belonging. His heart still beat quickly, and his palms felt sweaty. But he found himself raising his hand when the counselor paused to ask if anyone had questions. At first, his voice trembled as he asked something simple. But as the counselor responded kindly, with no judgment and no laughter from his peers, he felt stronger. The fear that had silenced him for so long started to fade away. As the lesson went on, Ethan asked another question, this time a little more confident. He realized that the more he spoke, the lighter his chest felt, as if a heavy weight was being lifted from him. Each answer the counselor gave helped turn his confusion into understanding and his fear into relief. For the first time, Ethan felt empowered. He discovered that asking questions was not a sign of weakness or embarrassment, but a sign of courage and maturity. Looking around the room, Ethan also noticed that he was not the only one listening closely. Some classmates nodded in agreement, others smiled with recognition, and a few even raised their own hands to ask questions. This reminded Ethan that he was never truly alone in his struggles. Everyone in that room had their own hidden worries, and together they were finding the answers they needed. By the end of the discussion, Ethan felt transformed. The nervous, restless boy who had once kept everything bottled up was beginning to find his voice. He realized that speaking up not only helped him, but also gave strength to others who were too shy to ask. What started as a moment of fear became a moment of empowerment. Ethan walked out of the classroom with his head held a little higher, no longer weighed down by loneliness, but lifted by the knowledge that he was not alone. When Ethan finally found the courage to raise his hand and ask his questions, the classroom atmosphere began to shift in a quiet but powerful way. For a long time, most of the children had carried unspoken thoughts and private worries about growing up. They had noticed changes in themselves, whether physical, emotional, or social, but embarrassment kept them silent. Each of them feared that speaking up might invite teasing or judgment from their classmates. So instead of asking, they kept their questions locked inside, pretending everything was fine. But when Ethan spoke, something remarkable happened. His bravery broke the invisible wall of silence that had been holding everyone back. The other children looked around the room and realized that if Ethan could ask something so personal without anyone laughing, maybe they could too. His actions showed them that curiosity was not shameful, and that seeking understanding was not a weakness but a strength. Slowly, hands began to rise across the classroom. At first, only a few students asked questions, quiet ones almost whispering, as if they were testing the waters. The counselor responded with patience, answering each question kindly and respectfully, never dismissing their concerns. This gentle approach reassured the children, encouraging more of them to join in. The timid whispers soon grew into a steady stream of voices. One student asked about why people grow at different rates. Another wondered why emotions sometimes felt overwhelming. Yet another wanted to know how to handle teasing from others. With each new question, the atmosphere in the room grew lighter. The students no longer felt like they were hiding in the shadows of confusion. Instead, they were stepping into a space of honesty and support. The classroom transformed into a place where curiosity was celebrated rather than suppressed. The fear of embarrassment, the very thing that had silenced them for so long, began to dissolve as they saw that their classmates were dealing with the same uncertainties. This shared experience created a sense of unity. Students who had once felt isolated in their private worries realized they were not alone. The nervous energy that had filled the room earlier was replaced by openness and relief. It was as if a heavy weight had been lifted from everyone's shoulders. Even the quieter students, the ones who usually kept to themselves, began nodding along and smiling, comforted by the fact that their unspoken questions were being voiced by others. The lesson was no longer just about learning facts. It was about breaking down barriers of shame and replacing them with understanding and respect. By the end of the discussion, nearly every student had either asked a question or felt reassured by someone else's. What began with one boy's trembling voice had turned into a chorus of curiosity and courage. The culture of silence, once heavy and unbreakable, had been replaced with something new, a culture of openness where questions were welcomed and embarrassment no longer had the power to control them. When the last student left the room and the sound of footsteps faded down the hallway, Miss Carter finally allowed herself to sit quietly at her desk. The classroom, once filled with the hum of voices and the rustle of papers, was now silent. She leaned back in her chair and took a deep breath, letting the events of the day settle in her mind. It had been no ordinary lesson, and she knew it. What began as a quiet observation of one troubled student had grown into something much bigger, a lesson about life that her students would carry with them for years to come. Ms. Carter thought back to Ethan, the boy who had looked so restless and confused not long ago. At first, she had worried that pulling him aside after class might embarrass him, but she trusted her instincts. She sensed that what he needed was not discipline or correction, but guidance and reassurance. That single moment of care opened the door to a larger conversation, one that ended up touching every child in the room. She smiled softly to herself, realizing how much courage it had taken for Ethan to ask his first question. His bravery had been the spark that ignited openness among his classmates. She reflected on the counselor's role, too. Their calm explanations had turned an awkward and often uncomfortable subject into something natural and understandable. For so long, these children had been carrying silent worries, afraid to voice them. Yet today, in the safety of her classroom, those hidden questions finally found a voice. Ms. Carter felt proud, knowing she had created the safe space where this could happen. Her mind wandered to the bigger picture. Teachers often focus on grades, tests, and assignments, but she knew education was much more than that. True teaching was about preparing children for life, helping them understand themselves and others, building their confidence, and showing them that they mattered. Today's lesson had not come from a textbook. Instead, it came from empathy, awareness, and the courage to face a difficult subject with honesty and care. As she looked around the empty classroom, Miss Carter thought about how differently things could have gone. If she had ignored Ethan's discomfort, he might have continued to struggle alone. If the class had never been given the chance to talk, the silence of embarrassment might have continued for months, even years. But today, the silence had been broken, and in its place, a new culture of openness had been born. Ms. Carter closed her notebook, feeling a quiet satisfaction. She hadn't just taught her students about science or health. She had given them something far more valuable, understanding, dignity, and the knowledge that they were not alone in their journey. What once seemed like an awkward mystery had been transformed into a powerful lesson about growing up and facing life with respect and courage. With a small smile, she turned off the lights and walked out of the room, proud of the day's work and hopeful for what her students would carry with them into the future.